Hi, everybody, and welcome to a new edition of Newsmakers. It is Friday, February 7th. I'm Jerry Roberts, and I am delighted to welcome back my old colleague and friend, Mark Z. Barabak, political columnist for the Los Angeles Times, who's been writing and opining about our new world that we're now inhabiting. Hey, man, welcome back. Thanks for taking the time.
Always happy to join you.
Hey, you've been on a roll lately, I have to say, with some really good columns. But I want to start with one from about, I don't know, a month or so ago, just before Trump came back to office. And it was about the attempts by one of our Congress members from California to help put in place a plaque for the police officers in Washington who battled the rioters on January 6, 2021. And apparently, doing such a thing, even though five police officers died after that and a number over 100 were injured, is quite controversial, and we can't approve such a thing. What's the story behind that?
Well, things come at us these days with such velocity. I think it's worth taking a step back. As you mentioned, I think it was like 140 some officers were injured. Five died, not on January 6th. We will always point out no one died on January 6th, but they died
The next
immediately
day.
afterward as approximate cause. Um, and these were people who quite literally put their life on the line to protect members of Congress, staffers, heaven forbid, reporters who were in the building, any tourists, literally put their lives on the line. And you could argue, if not saved democracy, certainly held the line. And so a resolution was introduced, as you suggest, to put up a plaque. Originally, they were going to honor all the officers who were involved, but that was impractical. So they named the agencies that were responsible for protecting the Capitol, honoring them and their service and what they did. Doesn't seem controversial. Democratic leaders signed off on it. Mitch McConnell, at the time, the Senate Republican leader, signed off on it. But Mike Johnson has been holding it up. He was asked about recently and does this, oh, gee, I don't know, I have to look into that. Kind of one of these vaporous non-answer answers. The bottom line is
Mike
they
Johnson, the dweeb Republican
yes, the House
speaker,
Speaker
and
who owes his speakership
Trump
entirely to Donald.
doormat. Yeah.
And of course, like so much else these days, it comes back to one man and his insecurities. I mean, for such a bold and brash bully, his awfully tender feelings. And apparently they thought that it would hurt the president's feelings or make him feel bad if he were to walk out to the west front of the Capitol, where originally he was going to take the oath of office and where it happened some of the worst violence on January 6th took place. So Mike Johnson has held up that plaque. Again, it's pretty straightforward. It's worth breaking down because, again, how are you going to pose a commemoration of people who performed their duty quite nobly that day? But, we passed through the looking glass
And of
some time
course,
ago.
the Republican, when you and I were young, the Republican Party was pro-police and
Yes, well,
back to blue.
yeah, and they will still profess to be. I mean, I did a joint column with my colleague Anita Chabray at the convention in Milwaukee, and they had a day or an evening. There's program each evening that was devoted to making America safe again, and it was all about backing the blue and the police and this, that, and the other thing. And I mentioned that column. It seems to be this collective amnesia. I mean, the words January and 6th were never spoken in tandem. So yes, you have this party that historically and to this day still campaigns as the party of law and order and backing the blue and being pro-police. Just to spin things forward, one of the president's first acts when Trump was back in office was to pardon 1,600 folks who were
Criminals,
convicted. I'm sorry? Yes,
criminals.
criminals. Yes, people who were convicted of crimes related to January 6th. Among them, people who assaulted police officers. I don't have the column in front of me, but in it, I enumerated some of the things they used: bear spray and mace and tasers. There was one cop who had a taser gun repeatedly jammed into his neck. And these are people who have been turned loose and set free and pardoned by the leader of the putative law and order back the blue party.
Yeah, that is the most, I don't know, it's hard to keep track and hard to list things, but I still think that's the most scandalous thing. I mean, it wasn't even as if they went through and said, oh, we're going to pardon all the people who didn't really commit violence or who didn't engage with police. It's just everybody. It's a blanket pardon. It's like
Well, and it should be said that in the days leading up to it, there was a suggestion that obviously, quote, obviously the president wasn't going to free those kinds of people. JD Vance, that's right. It was JD Vance who said that. Obviously, the president's not going to pardon those sorts of violent criminals. Well, guess what? He pardoned those kinds of violent criminals.
yeah, yeah. And as I recall, maybe I'm conflating two things, but the new Attorney General, Pam Bondi, when she was testifying before the Senate, uh, one of the Democratic senators asked her, whether she would support such pardons, and one of the Republicans jumped in and said, "Oh, that's such a ridiculous hypothetical. No, such a thing would never happen." But then they all went crickets as soon as it did happen.
Yeah.
There wasn't a peep out of any of the. I mean, that's to me, as we look at the whole sort of picture of what's going on in Washington, one of the most dangerous things is, I can't believe, but I've been looking at the Federalist Papers lately. I mean, the checks and balances and the balance of power was just such a fundamental uh, principle behind the Constitution. And the assumption was that the Congress would want to be equal, or at least a co-equal branch, given the
Yeah.
power of the purse. But Republicans controlling both the Senate and House have completely folded. They don't push back at all.
Well, and look, the founding fathers had their flaws and their issues, slavery, but they hit on something that really is pretty profound and pretty neat, which is this whole notion of checks and balances. Right? They were pushing back against a monarch. They did not want a king on America's soil, and so they came up with a system of checks and of balances. It's funny. I've been cutting way back on the time I spend on social media, and I recommend it to everybody. It's very good for the mind, good for the soul. But someone tweeted, it was quite funny. They said they're eating the checks, they're eating the balances. I mean, it really is pretty profoundly. It really is. I mean, the word that comes to my mind is disgusting. You had Tom Tillis, the senator from North Carolina, who's looking at a primary, who said that, oh yeah, some of what Trump's doing is unconstitutional, but I mean, but oh, okay, well, yeah, we're again, rinse, repeat. We're living in quite remarkable times.
Yeah, so in the absence, given the cravenness of Republicans in Congress, and the fact that the Democrats don't hold any institutional power, the courts have been the only institution that's even made a modicum of pushback on Trump. And there have been several of these federal cases, one involving the freeze on payments. And I guess the other one has temporarily at least halted this demand or request that everybody take a buyout. Sounds familiar. So, I mean, how surprised are you at the sort of political landscape in which we find ourselves? I mean, you and I have done this for decades, and this doesn't resemble anything that we've ever done, except maybe the first Trump administration.
No, surprised. I mean, you know, Trump pretty much laid a lot of this out. I mean, he was surprised, dissembling when it came to Project 2025, which he's following to the T. Oh, I never read it. Well, that's believable because I don't think he reads very much of anything. But this idea, there's some stuff that's just crazy, he said, and that, as Democrats suggested, seems to be the playbook that they're following. I mean, yeah, thank goodness for the courts. They seem to be the one thing that's holding the line. I mean, look, one thing about our system is we are not a parliamentary system. And by that, I mean, we can't dissolve government and have a vote of no confidence 3 weeks in Trump's administration. The next chance voters are going to have their say is in the midterms, which are in November of next year. So, I share the frustration with a lot of folks. I'm concerned, shocked, horrified, call it what you will. But I recognize that nothing's going to change until we have those elections. And I also think, Democrats, it's funny. I got a column coming up this weekend where I talked to the head of the San Francisco Democratic Party, of all places, who is a moderate. And you and I both know these things are on a curve. But, there is a reckoning in the Democratic Party. And I think we have seen in this last election that, first of all, yelling and jumping up and down and lighting your hair on fire, while it may be a way to release some of your angst, hasn't been real productive so far. And as much as it pains me, things like democracy, preserving and protecting democracy, culture, political norms, all those things don't seem to move voters as much as the price of eggs and bacon and gasoline. I mean, you can talk about it, and Democrats did. The threat to democracy, the threat to principles, the threat to the country, and on and on and on. And, as I described my colleague, this perceived goose stepping toward dictatorship. It's scary and it's frightening, but until and unless you get a critical mass of voters, not just Democrats or partisans or lighting their hair on fire, but people who are upset and vote. I mean, when I want to be optimistic, and I'm not off snowboarding or backpacking in the Sierra, I do think that there is nothing in our system of government that can't be remedied by voters. At the end of the day, the power lies with voters. In fact, I was having this conversation with someone who's expressing their concern, and they're a lot more freaked out, to use a term, than I am. They said, when do you start worrying? I said, I would start worrying if he canceled the next elections, right? That would worry me. Then we're like really, really in deep soup. But as long as voters are in the position to exercise their franchise and their voice, if Trump at all take it too far, and by that I mean I think people need to feel things in their lived experience, right? It's something to talk in abstract terms about Gavin, where'd that come from? Elon Musk taking over this, that, the other thing, and all that's an abstraction. If your Social Security check bounces, if you go to the VA and there's not a doctor to treat you, if the price of eggs continue going through the roof, I think that's what's going to move people. I would like to believe that people are going to act out of principle and these noble tenets of our democracy, and on and on and on and on and all that good stuff. But I think most people don't. I think most people are basically trying to get by in their daily lives, and unless these these actions that are being taken start to impact their daily lives, then I don't think it's going to register or matter to a lot of people.
Yeah, well, I checked just before we went on the air, and the price of eggs hasn't come down, nor is the war in Ukraine done over, which he promised to end on the first day. But
Right.
sure, be that as it may. Well, all right, let me ask you about something a little, perhaps slightly more practical, which is Trump's and the Republicans, that little dweeb Johnson again, attitude about disaster relief.
Yeah.
For the fires in LA, which they are, you wrote a column about this a couple of weeks ago, trying to, at least nominally, trying, who knows what's real and what isn't, tied to voter registration reform, which,
Yeah.
as you point
Well,
out, is such a crock.
Well, yeah, there are a couple of things. First of all, Trump said that he's going to change water policy, and there were two things that he was suggesting relief would be conditioned on. One was changing water policy, and I suggested a column that maybe that's been taken care of when he sent the military in to open that tap.
Open
water,
the tap.
right? There is no military. There is no tap. What he did do was release a couple billion gallons of water that basically were wasted. I mean, even farmers acknowledge it. It was like, this is water that's being stored for the summer. This is not water that flows to Southern California. This is water that basically evaporated.
Was there water, right?
Yeah. I mean, the most charitable thing you could say is it did replenish some of the groundwater, but basically it was a complete waste, and it was just Trump's way of flexing and saying, look what I can do. Okay, so let's say you take water off the table. The other thing is he talked about a California's grossly corrupt election system, without which he would have carried California. Now, I did the math, and he lost California by many, 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 many millions of votes. It was not.
See how bad it is? You see how bad it is, that vote?
Yeah. No need for a recount there. And there have been repeated studies done that have shown the incidence of voter fraud is vanishingly rare. And not being a math guy, but still able to get out my little calculator, I figured, that's only millions and millions shy of what Trump was talking about. So again, he's making up this non-issue, and he's threatening to hold it over California's head. Now, it should be said, our governor Gavin Newsom was back in Washington this week, had what he describes as a very cordial and productive conversation with Trump, which one surmises means he stroked and flattered him, because that seems to work with Trump. And maybe California will get the relief that it not just needs, but frankly deserves. I mean, the idea, and that's how I ended the column. It's like, there are ways you could look at ways to improve our election system. I mean, it takes a very long time to count, and I explained there why it's not nefarious. It's like there's a lot of ballots, it takes a while to count them, so there are tweaks that could be made, but not, I said, by holding tens of thousands of people hostage. That's just morally corrupt and just plain lousy.
Yeah, I want to talk about Gavin in a second, but I mean, the other point here is California is a so-called donor state. In other
Yes.
words, we contribute more to the federal treasury than other states do. I don't know. Last time I looked, it was $1.30, 35 or something.
Yeah.
A lot of it goes to these boneheads in red states who voted for him. And I haven't heard that argument surfaced either.
Well, and a lot of it goes as it should. I mean, when hurricanes devastate Florida, people don't say, well, why do you keep rebuilding? Why do you keep rebuilding these places? They get knocked down, and then you build them, and they get knocked down over and over and over again. I mean, that is a debate worth having and a conversation worth having, but not when people are like living in trailer parks, or not trailer parks, living in these modular houses they throw up, or couch surfing, or trying to get their lives together. I mean, there's just something very unseemly and frankly gross about it.
Cruel. It's cruel.
Conversations. Yeah, it is cruel. It is heartless, and it is cruel at its most basic. When people are suffering to play these kinds of political games.
Yeah. You also had a very good column, and people want to subscribe to your newsletter. They should do that for sure. About Silicon Valley and Trump, and certainly Musk is the most visible symbol of this, but you saw all these other tech bros, Zuckerberg and Bezos and others at the inauguration. Got better seats than the cabinet secretaries, but
Yeah.
But the interesting transformation there, because back in the 80s and 90s, these people working in Silicon Valley, executives and startups and so on, didn't really have a political bone in their body, but now suddenly have become sort of the new oligarchs. Talk about that transformation a little bit.
Yeah, that's, I guess, one of the benefits of keeping geezers like you and me around. I mean, I'm old enough to have covered one of the first stories I did when I came to the LA Times was this launch of this thing called TechNet. That was the shorthand for it at this place. It was actually at the Mountain View headquarters of a company called Netscape. And it was like, it said basically that, for all their import, even then as an economic engine, for the most part, Silicon Valley was very, very diffident toward politics. There were exceptions, of course. David Packard was a well-known Republican, got involved in Republican causes. Ed Chow, we're both old enough to remember him, ran for Senate, and this whole thing was this glittery high-tech background. But for the most part, they were not engaged. Well, that changed, and I talk about how that changed. And I wish I could remember her first name, but I'm reading a really good book that I recommend. I interviewed her. She's a University of Washington professor who wrote a book called The Code, and it's a history of Silicon Valley, and I really highly recommend it. Her last name is O'Mara, and she's not watching, but I apologize for forgetting her first name. But it's called The Code. It's a history of Silicon Valley, and it goes over a lot of really, really fascinating. But you fast forward from, as you said, these people who are really politically kind of naive / disengaged. It was like, right, we're above politics, we're hip, we're cool, we're inventing the future, we don't have use for these people, to the point where you have this billionaires row of oligarchs. I said, and here I'll quote myself again, I said, only in America, right? Which would be inspiring if it wasn't so dingy and gross. I mean, right? It was like, we have a Supreme Court that has ruled that money amounts to speech. And what you have is people who are able to shout. Well, really, the rest of us can only whisper. And that's the gross part to me. I mean, it's like, okay, that's great. Your products are fine. I'm talking on an Apple phone. I like listening to my iPod. Yes, I'm old school. I still have one of those. Um, but this idea that these people would not just have so much power, but for Trump to put it on display, and I don't know if it was a case of him sort of bringing to heel these masters of the universe, or of them asserting their power, but the whole scene was just, to my mind, pretty gross.
Yeah. I mean, you look at Zuckerberg and Bezos, and they just, sort of are revolting, but they kind of do it for, I think they're doing it for business purposes because God knows they need more money. But then
Yeah.
you look at Musk, and there is a sui generis case. I mean, a very singular. I don't know what he is up to, the world's richest man, the government's largest contractor, Trump's biggest campaign contributor, and he runs his own social media platform with what, 650 million people or something. That's kind of a scary thing, is it not?
Well, I think it's worth not just saying he contributed a lot of money. He spent more than $250 million. That's with the B, folks. $250 million to elect Donald Trump. I don't care if he spent $250 million to elect Kamala Harris or Jerry Roberts or Fred Flintstone. The idea that one individual would spend that much, it's just, again, to use that word, it's just grotesque.
Yeah. Now he's got his hands on the Social Security data.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm thinking of something that Trump said. Speaking of interesting people who will probably sue me during the administration, Robert Kennedy Jr. He said, "Go crazy." And that's what Gavin. That's what Gavin. Why do I keep wanting to call Elon? I guess it's the O and the Gavin, the Elon. But anyway, that's what Elon Musk seems to be doing, going crazy. And it's
Yeah.
very, and the thing is, I understand that, it's a lot of, I mean, the people who are doing all this work are these people who are, barely out of college. One of them, I guess, was there were like two people who a judge granted access to certain data. And by the end of the day, one of them had to resign because the Wall Street Journal surfaced a whole bunch of tweets, including one in which he claimed he was proudly racist ahead of his time. I don't know what that would have been, going back to the caveman, right? I think we've always had racism, but I don't know. Anyway, that was his point, not mine.
All right, real quick. Gavin, who announced an election night or soon thereafter that we were going to lead the resistance again, has suddenly become Trump's best friend. That those pictures of him sort of standing at the bottom of the stairs when Air Force One came a week or so ago was sort of sad. But how do you think he's doing in navigating this very tricky terrain?
I have been critical of our governor when I think he deserves it. I've heard firsthand from our governor when he hasn't liked some of the things that I've written about him. Um, I think, look, I come from the pragmatic school of politics, and I think if you need to, I mean, look, Gavin might feel good about pounding his chest and calling Trump out on a lot of the awful things that he's doing, and I think they are awful. I think we can stipulate. We've talked about so the last half hour talking about that. But if he needs to do the kinds of things he needs to do, such as flattering Trump and doing the sorts of things that he's doing, because again, we're playing with people's lives. I mean, we're talking about people who are who've lost literally everything. And if this is what it's going to take, sad as it may be, to get the relief and the help that they need and deserve and should get, I'm not going to criticize Gavin in this instance for doing what I think he has to do. Again,
What do you think it does to vis-a-vis his 2028 aspirations?
oh, that's so far off. I mean, look, I need to put a big asterisk next to that. I think I think Gavin could whatever. Gavin could go to the White House and with a Sharpie and write anti-Trump graffiti all over it and do all the anti-Trump things in the world. And I think just on the natural, I am skeptical of Gavin's prospects in 2028. Period. Full stop. Simply because he is from California. I don't know if the Democratic Party is going to have a huge appetite for another perceived San Francisco liberal atop their ticket. So, anything I say about Gavin and his 2028 chances and how something might affect it, have to be caveated or used as a starting point. This notion that I'm very, very skeptical, which is all the more reason for him to do the right thing. I mean, it's funny. You and I both cover politics long enough to know that sometimes doing the right thing. I mean, case in point, you go all the way back to Hillary Clinton, right? Do we think that she really supported the invasion of Iraq? No. What did she do? She supported it because it was the politically astute thing to do. And what happened? She ended up losing the nomination to Barack Obama. Why? So it's like, I've said, if I was a political consultant, advisor, strategist, I wouldn't make very much money if I was billing by the hour, because my advice would be very simple. Be who you are and do what you think is the right thing to do.
No.
And let the consequences sort themselves out. In this case, I think Gavin is doing the right thing. Again, it may be distasteful, it might be stomach turning, but at the end of the day, he's serving the people he was elected to serve, which are the people of California.
Speaking of San Francisco liberals, what do you think Kamala Harris is going to do? She's going to run for governor?
Boy, I honestly don't know. I mean, speculate. I would be somewhat surprised if she did. I mean, you and I both are quite fond of Dianne Feinstein, who we covered for a long time, both of us, and we know that was always her dream job. In fact, if I can pay a posthumous compliment, I'd say one of the most honorable things I ever saw in decades of covering politics was in 2003 during the recall, when she could have waltzed into the governor's office. She really could have, but as a matter of principle, she opposed Gray Davis's recall, and she did not run.
She opposed recalls because
she opposed the recall. She did, and I think that's one of those honorable things, because that was her dream job. She could have had it, and she turned it down. So to bring it back to Kamala Harris, I don't get the sense that she has a burning desire to be governor of California. If she has any hope of being president, which she probably still does, I don't know. She hasn't confided in me. You can't run for governor, and then 2 years later turn around and run for president. It's going to be an either or.
That was Nixon's plan.
That was Nixon's plan. We saw how that worked out. I mean, yes, he was elected, but it was not a linear.
It took him 6 years after that.
Exactly. So again, long way of saying I don't know. I would be not shocked but surprised if she did, because again, I don't think that's her dream job. I don't think she wakes up with her heart going pity pat at the prospect of being California governor.
Do you remember that time? It was probably like 1989 or 1990. We went to a Democratic state convention up in Sacramento, and Dianne was there. Dianne didn't like to go to those conventions, and she hadn't appeared at something. We went to her hotel door,
yes,
on the door, and she came out and she goes, "Oh, I'm just a snot factory."
I will never forget. Dianne, as we both know, and I will not go into graphic detail here, but as we both know, Dianne had a certain penchant for these very anatomically graphic descriptions of bodily fluids and bodily functions. And here's this very matronly San Francisco, not matronly, but very prim and proper. And if there was a criticism of Dianne, it was that she was such a prig. In fact, to this day, the single best quote is the one you got about, Dianne doesn't care who you sleep with as long as you're in bed by 10 o'clock. Fits her to a T. But that said, she did have that funny thing where, like I said, she had these really gross and graphic discussions of bodily fluids and stuff. We've had a lot of laughs over the years.
All right. From the first weeks of the Trump administration to bodily fluids, that seems to close the circle fairly well. Mark Z. Barabak, political columnist for the Los Angeles Times. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time on Newsmakers.